And let's bring in Kevin Rudd now, the President and CEO of the Asia Society, and of course the former Australian Prime Minister. You've got four Aussies for the next 10 minutes on the show right now, joining us from the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Mr. Rudd, great to see you there. Thanks very much for joining us. Of course, lots to talk about when it comes to China, when we, of course, commemorate the 100th year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. But you've recently commented that the best way for the West to deal with China when it comes to human rights and security is as a collective group rather than individual nations pointing the finger and then perhaps seeing some kind of retribution coming back from China. What did you make of the messaging that we got out of recent forums like the G7 when it came to dealing with China collectively?
The core element for us all to understand with China's rise is simply the scale of that rise. China is huge. We've known that for a long time in terms of its population, but so too with the growth in its per capita income, so grows its overall aggregate economic size in the world. And so too does the rise occur in terms of its military capability, as has just been pointed out through your report. So that is the key fact at play here. I think the second is this: in the binary relationship between China and the United States, what we've seen now over the last 20 to 30 years is bit by bit the shift in the balance of power between this emerging Chinese great power and the United States. And we've seen this, of course, in the economy. We've seen it also, of course, with the military. China, in terms of its economic size measured as GDP against market exchange rates, is likely to pass the United States by the end of the 2020s, perhaps in the early 2030s. And militarily within East Asia and the West Pacific now, something approaching military parity or a slight Chinese net advantage has already been achieved. So therefore, this is the underpinning, as it were, geoeconomic and geopolitical and geostrategic reality. So I think thirdly, therefore, what follows is, in responding to that, what is almost inevitably unfolding is an increasing number of nations working together militarily or economically to balance against China's rise. That's one thing follows from another, and we're seeing that reality unfold before us as the years open up.
Right. Of course, when it comes to the military side of the equation, of course, there's a lot of concern from nations when it comes to particularly the G7 about the situation between China and Taiwan and the possibility of some sort of conflict there. How would you rate that? Is there any prospect of some sort of military conflict between, of course, China and Taiwan that presumably the United States would get involved in? And then what would that look like?
I think it's important when we understand China's military rise that its principal organizing approach is how they plan for what it's called the Central Taiwan Contingency. You mentioned before we're approaching the 100th anniversary of the birth of the Communist Party, and the Communist Party has now been in power since 1949. But from China's perspective and the Communist Party's perspective, the unfinished business lies in the question of, quote, reunification, unquote, with Taiwan. Therefore, when you see this massive, as it were, a growth in China's overall military power, it's being organized around this central principle of how to secure Taiwan's return, either by A, causing the Americans, Taiwan's long-term military supporter, to say at the end of the day, that this is too hard and too difficult, and we Americans should not fight in a war, which we are, as it were, likely to lose, or B, if push comes to shove and you do end up in military conflict, that China on balance would prevail because of an overwhelming force of arms. So when we look at China's military rise, its principal lens is always the Taiwan contingency. What are the probabilities there? I think people are getting a little too excited about the possibility of a Taiwan conflict in the near term. However, if Xi Jinping is reappointed as General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party at the 20th Party Congress at the end of next year, I think what we'll then be moving into is a period where China will be looking at its options to leverage Taiwan back into a form of political union with China by the time we get to the late 2020s and into the 2030s. And that's when I believe it does get dangerous for us all.
Mr. Rudd, Sam here joining the conversation. Just sticking with the regional theme, as you would have heard in my report just then, obviously China's participation in things like RCEP have been described as a geopolitical victory for China and also a coup, of course, because it doesn't include the US. How do you see things playing out in that sense, given a lot of the countries that are involved in those sorts of trade pacts do have concerns about China? And on the same token, should China be worried about the Quad members?
You're right to point out in your report where China has gone from and to as far as trade policy is concerned. China was very quick to join what you've described as RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, involving, frankly, most of the East Asian economies, except, of course, for India and except, of course, for the United States. I think what Washington will be most concerned about is China also now indicating it may seek membership of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a much, as it were, more ambitious free trade agreement linking 11 of the economies of East Asia, including Japan, and including countries and economies like Australia as well. The bottom line is this. The soft underbelly of American grand strategy as it relates to China is trade. Domestically in the United States, you have high levels of protectionist sentiment evidenced in the United States Congress, not just in the, as it were, labor union-leaning Democratic Party, but frankly now across the aisle in the Trump-leaning Republican Party. And if you've got protectionist sentiment within the United States, it makes it very difficult for America to therefore leverage its way back into either the Trans-Pacific Partnership or, on top of that, the existing RCEP trade arrangement as well. China knows this. Chinese strategists are highly intelligent. They understand Washington well. They understand the protectionist sentiment. So I think the rest of the region needs to buckle up and get ready for a high level of Chinese level of initiative as far as trade policy is concerned in the period ahead. Because the sheer size of the Chinese economy, the sheer size of the trade footprint of the Chinese economy means that it acts, to use Xi Jinping's own term, as a gravitational force pulling countries in. And if the United States is absent from that because of its own domestic protectionist, in my view, nonsense, then as a result of that, ultimately the economic game is going to be won by the Chinese unless America changes.
And Mr. Rudd, bringing it back to President Xi Jinping just very, very quickly, I put this to another guest earlier in our shows, but I'm really keen to get your thoughts on that. What are the implications perhaps of having a little bit too much power? Is that somewhat self-defeating, do you think?
Well, Xi Jinping, who I've met a number of times in my own political career and post-political career, is a formidable Chinese leader. That's the bottom line. He knows his own mind, he's got a game plan for the country, and a clear, as it were, political and military stratagem as the country becomes more dominated by the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese private sector has to be, as it were, more attentive to the demands of the Chinese Communist Party, and its foreign policy becomes more assertive over time. But the one problem, which Chinese political analysts will also put to you somewhat furtively, is that because his political power is so dominant as an individual, it means that the advisors around him are going to become possibly more timid in the objective advice they provide in terms of the reaction to China around the world. That, I think, is a casualty or a difficulty within the system.
Mr. Rudd, Dan Murphy joining the conversation from Dubai. I wanted to ask you about the situation on the ground in Australia, because a headline from our good colleagues at CNN in the past 24 hours, no less, say Sydney in lockdown, borders shut, and hardly anyone vaccinated. How long can Australia go on like this? How is it possible, in your opinion, that a wealthy, sophisticated country like Australia still has less than 5% of the population vaccinated and seemingly no exit strategy when it comes to lockdowns and reopening up the country? How did it all go wrong here?
I think there have been two major errors of public policy on the part of the current Australian government. One is in, let's call it the area of national quarantine policy, and that is all incidences of community outbreak in Australia of COVID-19, including all of its variations, have occurred through returning Australians who have gone into one form of quarantine control or another. But because these have been implemented through a series of ad hoc hotel-based arrangements rather than dedicated quarantine facilities, and preferably outside of capital cities, frankly, there's been one leak after another in one state capital after another, resulting in one series of lockdowns after another. So that's one big area of policy failure. But the second, I think, is equally serious, and that is a failure of vaccination policy. The Australian government seems to have put all its eggs in one basket, which was the AstraZeneca vaccine. And when the scare emerged about, let's call it unintended side effects of AstraZeneca, despite them being very small, we then began to see a huge wobble in the national administration of vaccine policy and strategy. And that actually had a huge effect on the actual uptake of vaccines across the country. And then because they did not diversify their supply sufficiently to have a big, as it were, alternative supply of either Moderna or of Pfizer or of J&J, as a result, Australians didn't have, as it were, a second option to go to by and large. And as a result, they've chosen not to be vaccinated. Now, the catastrophe arises, of course, when you get a variation of the virus like Delta or Delta Plus arriving on Australia's shores with low vaccination levels. Then you end up in the sort of lockdowns across Australia that you see at the moment, including the area where I am in what is normally a very safe environment in southeast Queensland.
Indeed, and I also wanted to ask you to bring it back to the conversation around China about Australia's trade policy with Beijing, because we've also learned just in the past 24 hours that Australia has also filed a complaint to the WTO over China's duties on bottled wine imports, and that, of course, follows the complaint on barley imports late last year. Where do you see this heading, and how concerning is the trade relationship between Australia and China as it stands today?
Well, the bottom line is there is an unfolding trade war between China and the United States, albeit in selective categories of trade. China, for example, has not taken punitive action in the area of iron ore for the simple reason China's domestic demand is strong as China's own recovery comes back, and there is no credible alternative global supply at scale to what Australia provides through a combination of BHP, Rio, and Fortescue metals. And the Brazilian alternatives through Vale are simply not up to the task. But on the rest of the trade relationship, you see all sorts of skirmishes breaking out, and also open hostilities commence, not yet to the stage of a general trade war. Personally, my view is that it's no bad thing that the dispute resolution mechanisms of the World Trade Organization have now been called in to deal with these. Some have been initiated by China and some by Australia. The key thing will be the credibility of the WTO dispute resolution mechanisms in bringing about an effective arbitration or conclusion on these matters. And we also know they do take a long time.
Just final question before we let you go. How does the United States, Australia, repair their relationship with China going forward? Of course, we still have the issue that we just spoke about at the start of this interview, Taiwan hanging over the situation as well. Where do we progress from here as we look forward to the next 100 years of the CCP?
That's a nice, easy one to finish our conversation with today. It's like the history of the Western novel in 30 seconds. But let's have a go. Look, we've got to be realistic about this. You have a rising power, it's called China. You have an established power called the United States. You have the economic and military, as it were, aggregate power now achieving some level of balance. And as a consequence, we're at one of those difficult stages in international relations history where it is the rise of one power and the reaction of the established power which often generates strategic instability And as my friend and colleague from Harvard, Graham Allison, would say, in the bulk of circumstances end up in crisis, conflict and war. So there's a structural factor at play here. How do you deal with it and how do you prevent it? And that goes as much for the United States as it does for its allies, including Australia. I thought about this a lot. There is no silver bullet here, but the concept I've advanced both to our Chinese friends and to our American friends is one of what I describe as managed strategic competition. In other words, strategic red lines on both sides understand about their core security interests, for example, around Taiwan, so we don't have inadvertent crisis by accident and escalation and war. Secondly, strategic competition full-blown across the rest of foreign policy, non-lethal national security policy, together with the full dimensions of economic policy, trade, investment and tech, while a third basket still being possible, which is strategic collaboration in areas such as climate change, global debt management, the matters you raised before about debt levels coming off the back of the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. In other words, how can we walk and chew gum across these three domains? I think this could require, and could only be achieved, I should say, with high-level diplomatic agreement between the leaders of both the United States and China to recognize that they are in competition, but to put strategic guardrails around it so we do not end up triggering crisis, conflict and war by accident.
Prime Minister, we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there, but thank you, as always, for taking the time out to have a conversation with us today. We appreciate it. That's Kevin Rudd there, President and CEO of the Asia Society and the former Australian Prime Minister.